Hello and welcome back. I'm really looking forward to this session because it's about how central banks are progressing on this curve to continuous delivery, to automation. And also we're going to be touching, well, more than touching, on how central banks and supervisors are employing new technologies in automation, including natural language processing and AI, to help with supervision. So hopefully we're going to make that bridge between how central banks' adoption of new technologies is informing the way that they supervise banks. And we also have on the panel alongside representatives from the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, we have Inflectra, Sandman, who's the CEO of Inflectra, which is a testing company that specializes in regulated markets, and Bill Curtis, Dr. Bill Curtis of CISQ, which is a US-based association that promotes industry standards for software quality. And indeed, I guess Bill will tell us a little bit about how those standards are being spread throughout the world and what exactly they are, and how, again, they apply to regulated markets. There's a lot to talk about with the new presidential executive order on cybersecurity to talk about. We'll rush through things and try and cover as much as possible. But we're going to start with Mark Wilson from the Bank of England, where testing is being transformed, and Mark is going to tell us about that. And Mark, if you don't mind introducing yourself a little bit and telling us about your role and what your project entails.
Okay, thank you for that. Welcome. My name's Mark Wilson. I've been at the bank for 6.5 years. 5 years I was employed as the on-site principal consultant for our main test resourcing provider, Testing Solutions group. And so I've been a member of the bank since January of last year. I moved over from consultancy to a full-time role at the bank. So my current role is test practice lead, responsible for all core testing activities, both manual and automated, for the technology division within the bank. We provide functional resources for all BAU activities, business as usual, and all new projects and programs. I'm also the de facto go-to person for all third parties. So I deal with all of our external clients that provide our various different levels of service at the bank. Prior to my time working at the bank, I worked for quite a few blue chip financial companies. I worked for JP Morgan in Luxembourg, HSBC in Dublin, Standard Life, Close Brothers, and 17 years working at Fidelity Investments. I did 14 years in IT and 3 years running the business testing department. I also spent time in India setting up the offshore testing team, and then managing a team of 30 from the UK. So currently, what are we working on? Very, very busy time for us at the moment. We have our main supplier of testing resources at the bank. We have a framework agreement with this company, and that ends in September of this year. So we're talking to alternative suppliers currently about transitioning from them, who are very manually based testing outfit, to more automation based testing, and primarily using Eggplant. Eggplant is the tool of choice for us going forward when it comes to automation. So we're talking with a lot of organisations that provide or have partnerships with Eggplant, and that's proved quite successful. One of the things we're looking at is the transition plan. How's it going to work? We've had the incumbent at the bank for I think it's almost 8 years. And in that time, we've got a lot of the same resources during that period of time they've been here. So we've got to transition their experience, their knowledge from the incumbent to the proposed. So that's the challenge that we're having at the moment, how that's going to work. So one of the things that we're looking to do, we have a lot of automated regression packs. We're looking to remediate those packs and migrate those to Eggplant. So we're setting up a testing team to primarily look at that. There's quite a few, there's probably about 40 or 50 regression packs that we need to remediate. And what else am I working on? I'm also doing test environment management and test data management tender reviews. We're just going through the awarding of new contracts to new suppliers. So it's a very, very busy period for us at the moment. And I'm kind of responsible for most of that. So we have 80 people in our department. In terms of various different resources, 45 of those are external consultants and 35 are internal bank resources, ranging from junior testers all the way up to program test managers. What else?
I'll ask you a couple of quick questions, Mark, just
Yeah,
about what you've said. Really interesting. So you're at the beginning of a new start of a new transformation program. Effectively, I guess I won't put words into your mouth, but do you have, with these new partners, do you have objectives and benchmarks for where you want to get to over, say, 3 years in terms of automate?
So as a central bank, we're more than aware of our fiscal responsibilities, and we need to be seen to looking for value for money and to make sure that the new organisation or organisations, we may go with a hybrid approach, we're not sure yet. They give us value for money in terms of day rates. For example, there'll be no increase in day rates for any consultancy resources that come in. We're looking, in fact, to decrease some of the day rates, especially on the automation side, which are quite high. So anything that I can do in terms of saving the bank money would be appreciative by the powers that be. So at the end of the year, I'll get a really nice bonus. That would be nice, wouldn't it? So yeah, we're looking at ways of saving money right across everything that we do. Return on investment, value for money, ensuring that the whoever we partner up with do come with relationships with the other third parties that can provide us with value also. Any open source tools, anything that we can utilize that's not going to cost us any additional money. So yeah, value for money is the kind of the mantra for this year for us.
So there'll be savings, there'll be efficiencies and economies. What about quality benchmarks, code quality benchmarks, benchmarks for, I don't know, defect management?
Yeah, we use quite a lot of tools in terms of test management at the moment. We're trying to consolidate into using Jira. Jira is something else that we've rolled out, and there's a lot of initiatives on the Jira side to make sure that everyone within the domain actually uses Jira. Previously, we've not had that. We want to be able to have metrics available to us so we can track how everyone is performing, what we're working on. The MI that we can produce is significantly better than we have currently, which wouldn't be too hard because it's quite minimal, to be honest. But yeah, we're fully embracing Jira and Confluence. One of the things we're doing on Confluence is all of the information that has been retained in our existing consultants' heads for the last few years. We have got down into Confluence. We're about 95% complete now of all of the projects. All of our portfolio of work is now everything about what they do, test scripts, dashboards, key contacts, all sorts of things that are associated with all of our projects are now retained within a repository in Confluence. So we're quite confident that when we do onboard a new supplier, that it would be a fairly easy transition for us.
And do, just a final quick question before we move on to Knarig. And this might be a dumb question, you can tell me if it is, but do central banks discuss, and compare their transition programs, their digital change and their testing objectives and processes? I mean, do you get together in forums to discuss these, or are your comparisons more with other financial services firms in the UK, or indeed with other government agencies?
Yeah, I'm sure that there are people within our technology that do that from a central banking point of view. For me personally, not. I deal with other financial institutions, not necessarily central banks. Some of my peers do likewise. We don't really. I mean, this is the first forum for me when we're dealing with like-minded individuals in same kind of areas of responsibility. But no, to be perfectly honest, I don't really get the time. I'm hoping to get more time in the future to attend such things, but it's not on my radar at the moment now.
Okay, let's move on to Knarig and a different topic. Knarig, do you mind introducing yourself and telling us about your project, your interesting project with NLP, natural language processing?
Sure. Before I begin, I do have to say the disclaimer that the views that I express are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Federal Reserve. So my name is Knarig Arabshian. I joined the Fed about 5 years ago. And when I joined, it was mainly to establish natural language processing initiatives and AI initiatives at the bank. Prior to my time at the Fed, I was in academia, both as a professor and also research scientist at Bell Labs for over 5 years as well. So my specialty has always been in natural language processing, more in the linguistic and logical methods, using ontologies, knowledge graphs. But recently now with the new advancements in machine learning and deep learning, I've started to employ a lot of those techniques as well. So when I first came at the Fed, there was already an initiative within the innovation group where they were doing proof of concepts of various vendors, natural language processing vendors, to try to see if it could be used for a lot of our unstructured documents, because we get a lot of unstructured text from banks, a lot of reports, and many of these reports are very lengthy and very contextual, nuanced language. And so we have two main groups that we are working with in the bank. One is the supervision group and one is the markets group. Within markets, they do market monitoring, and they're the ones who are involved with more of the FOMC meetings and the rates, etc. So their data is a little bit different, where they're getting a lot of news data, dealer chatter, dealer reports, and so their data is a little bit more like news clips. And the NLP work there is different, whereas the supervision group, they get a lot of long documents from the banks assessing their own risk, or various types of modeling that they've been doing and that we have to verify. And so initially when I joined, we did a full vendor search of NLP vendors to try to see whether or not we can employ a vendor to be able to process our documents. But I had a hunch that was not going to happen, because our use case is so specific that we were most likely going to end up implementing our own. And that's what ended up happening. So within a year, I, along with one of my colleagues, we co-prototyped a solution that extracts language from language of interest from documents. And it's both a rule-based and machine learning system, which is very applicable for supervision's use case, because in supervision, just generic NLP techniques don't necessarily work. People are really looking for the needle in a haystack, very fine particular sentences. So that's why we employed this technique. And currently this is now rolled out to all of supervision. They're using it. It has shown that the software itself has brought their work down from like a week of analyzing the reports to a matter of a day or two. It's also being rolled out in other banks as well. So it's been a good it's been very successful. So now we're looking at other types of NLP as well in other areas, both in supervision and in markets. And yeah, that's been my work.
Great. And we've had a previous events, a couple of people talking about this topic of the application of AI and NLP to banking supervision, and there's a project called the Regulatory Genome Project, which the University of Cambridge is running to sort of bring together work in this field that we've heard about. But what are the testing challenges that you face in the project, Knarig?
Yeah. So for any so AI and building any type of AI software is, I would say, much more dependent on the user than maybe other types of generic software, even though you do depend on users there. But within AI and natural language processing, machine learning, what you're trying to do is really mimic the analyst or whoever the end user is, their task. So when we were developing it or prototyping it, we had many sessions. It was like we were given a focus group of subject matter experts. They were about 5 people who sat down with us, and you know, while we were prototyping it, analyzing all the results, giving us feedback. So what our tool does, for example, subject matter experts or analysts will take documents and they'll highlight the particular sentences in a document that are of interest, like risk-related topics or whatever the topic is that they're looking for. And they gather those sentences and create a summary and bring it up to management. So our task was to actually do that, take the document, highlight the particular sentences within the document, and then give like a bird's eye view of all the highlights, the topics that the documents are talking about, so that the user can peruse through them. And so it was very important for them to get the right sentences. And it's also very important for them, for the software not to miss any sentences. So they had to get comfortable with false positives because we could not miss a sentence. So if we fine-tuned it too strict, sometimes we would miss sentences. So that process of going back and forth with the user, where we have an output, we show it to the users come back to us and say, actually, you missed a few sentences, or actually these sentences have been highlighted and they're not useful, go back. And so the matching algorithm, even though we had an idea of exactly what we had to do, was tweaked over time with the users in mind. Also, we are using a lexicon. So the lexicon is created by the user, and we as on the technology side, we're really helping them figure out how to create that lexicon, because the technology people oftentimes don't understand the business to the detailed level. But we had to be there to tell them, for example, you know, this rule might be too specific, broaden it a little, or if it's too broad, it's going to highlight too many things. And so we were helping them tweak it, but it was a very collaborative effort. It wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the subject matter experts with us. And after the prototype was completed, we went into beta in production. And at that point, we had very large documents, batches of documents being processed. So initially with the prototype, we had like about 20 documents, and that's what we were working with. When like over 1,000, 2,000 documents started getting processed, immediately we started seeing, okay, there's certain flaws that we have to go back and fix. For example, some of the highlights that they were seeing were headers and footers in the document, and headers and footers are complete sentences that often are very appropriate to the document, or risk-related sentences, or whatever it is that they're looking for. But you don't want 500 of the same sentences highlighted. So we had to go back and redo our pre-processing and make sure that we were removing these things. So it's this type of work that has happened. Like, I think within 6 months of back and forth, the software stabilized, and we still do enhancements, but at this point, it's not like fixing major problems in the software. It's more enhancing it, making it better, giving new features, etc.
Well, thank you very much. It's a really interesting project. Adam, can I turn to you? I know Inflectra has, as I mentioned at the outset, you specialize in customers working in regulated markets. Mm-hmm. Where do you see central banks in general on the curve in terms of digital transition, and how do they compare with companies working in other regulated industries?
Oh, thank you, Matthew. It's a great question. I mean, as a company at Inflectra, and I can speak for the companies, which makes it easier. Every industry has its nuances, and we work a lot in financial services, insurance. We also work with life sciences, medical devices, aerospace, defense, all very highly regulated industries, yet with different rules and regulations and different approaches to their automation, although some common tooling, which is interesting. But one of the things I was thinking is that, some of our clients are national banks, some are commercial banks, some are insurance companies, and some are insurance regulators. So for example, the Hungarian National Bank and the Deutsche Bundesbank are two of our customers, an insurance regulator in India. Plus we also have then commercial banks and insurance companies who are being regulated by these same organizations. And in some ways, the central banks themselves have their business systems. They have tons of stuff they have to automate and test internally, but they also want in many cases to prove out technologies. So when they make recommendations to the industry at large that they regulate, they have a proof of concept, they have test beds, things that they can use to have real world practical experience. And one of the things, actually a couple of things from hearing what Mark and Knarig said were very interesting for me. One is that the concept of the third parties, right? As a central bank, you don't necessarily want to build a monolithic stack, even if it's the most appropriate for your own needs, because you really want to be able to demonstrate different technologies, different tooling, and different approaches that could be used by the member institutions. And so I'll pick on Eggplant. We have a test management platform, we have test automation tools, but we also integrate with Eggplant and other various competitive vendors because we know that our customers and their customers don't need a monolithic solution, they need an open platform. And I think that has to be the way of the future. When I started out doing, working at Inflectra in QA 15 years ago, there was a big vendor that had, load testing and functional testing and test management tool, which everyone used, and you all know what I'm talking about, I think. But that was it. You would literally use one for each. But now it's much more specialized. If you're doing very highly visual testing, there's some really great AI-based tools for that. If you're doing what Mark's doing, I mean, Eggplant's being used by many of our clients in defense, in financial services. It's got a lot of great functionality in certain areas, and then other tools are better for like mobile banking apps and stuff. So the days of monolithic automation are gone. So you need open platforms that work with other tools and across the competitive landscape of the vendor space. And the second challenge we're seeing with the central banks and highly regulated banks and other industries is a lot of the data privacy rules that started out with GDPR. We've also done a lot of work with healthcare, where HIPAA is the law of the land, but that's becoming, I think, commonplace in almost every industry. We're seeing a lot of our clients, for example, in India, there are data residency rules. Any transactional data can't leave India. And actually, it's interesting you mentioned Jira and Confluence, because since October last year, it's been gone crazy for us because we have a lot of financial service clients that are actually moving off Jira and Atlassian because of their phasing out the server product. And so a lot of the clients can't move to the cloud, same with some of our defense clients. And so they're really concerned. And we have some migration paths, but also if they are hosting in the cloud, it has to be hosted in country, but without any talk back to a corporate directory service, identity management system. So even if you are in the cloud, how is the cloud structured? Where is the identity management being done? Is it done in country, out of country, replicated? There's so many fascinating aspects. I'm sure Bill's getting into this more in the cyber side, which is definitely more his bailiwick than mine. But it's fascinating, these different areas. And in terms of AI, which was mentioned, even in the UI automation space, for many years, we've been teaching humans to be machines. So if you use Selenium, right, as a tester, I test an app as a human, I can interact with it, I can use my human intuitive experience. But as an automation engineer, I'm being forced to act like a machine, coding, using XPath and CSS and all these browser tools. And yet that's not what humans do well. Machines do that well. So we should be having the machines do all of that nuts and bolts of automation, but have the user give the feedback. Have the machine try and automate, and then it gives back feedback and says, did I find that button? Was it a false positive? And you can train it. So we're seeing that in automation. I think in 10 years, no one's going to be doing manual test automation in code. It's all going to be training machine models, and probably the same with like load testing and certainly security, pattern recognition. They're already in that direction. So it's just a fascinating space. But I do think one last thing is we should be looking across industries. I do feel like when we work with life science clients, they have a whole bunch of FDA rules. We work with financial service clients or aerospace clients. The rules are like 70% similar, 30% different for no good reason in many cases. And I think there's a lot of lessons that could be learned cross industry. And hopefully organizations like Bill's can maybe help with that.
Well, that's really interesting. Before we go to Bill, I'm going to ask you one sort of supplementary question about that, Adam. Because
please.
I said at the outset, we've heard about change within central banks. we've heard about how central banks are adopting new technologies, particularly for supervision. How do you see one informing the others? Do you see a trend here, particularly in the context of, there's a move towards more prescriptive standards for operational resilience? This is something central banks and supervisors are working on right now, which includes software risk management. And some supervisors in some parts of the world, like the Singaporeans, have written guidelines on software testing. The Swiss and the Hong Kong regulators are seen to be more prescriptive than, for example, the Europeans and the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve banks and the OCC. So do you see a trend toward central banks and learning from their own experience and applying those lessons to the way they supervise?
Right, and again, we're a commercial vendor, so I'm not speaking for any central bank. I'll
make
my own disclaimer. I think what we're seeing is that the idea is that in industries that are mission critical, and financial services is as mission critical in its own way as any other of the industries we work in, and in life sciences and in some of the mission systems that we work with, like the Lockheeds and Northrops of the world. Independent verification and validation and the rule-based testing and having to follow very prescriptive standards is the norm. Other industries, it's less so. I do feel like we're going to head towards that way, where there will be potentially the requirement for an independent analysis before something goes live. Before you migrate from one, say, banking account platform to another, where we've heard horror stories in the news. I'm not going to mention the banks, but we all know of them. Could that have been prevented by forcing a commercial bank to have an independent regulator or independent company report back to a regulator and say, well, this is their test plan, this is their risk management plan, here's what we've analyzed, these are what we're seeing, we think they shouldn't go live, versus the bank deciding, well, we'll take the risk, we're insured, we'll take the publicity hit, and making a business ROI decision. But then if the economy of the country is impacted, does the bank have the right to make that kind of decision? So too big to fail. Which is certainly medical devices, it's not allowed. You can't, as a medical device company, voluntarily decide that I'll take the risk of this hurting someone. But yet, in other industries, we don't always have that. So I do think that's going to happen. But on the other hand, you've got agile, CI/CD, increasing speed. So that's going to be the challenge for the age, is how do you balance compliance and speed? Because one is somewhat at the expense of the other, even with automation. And I think just getting that balance right is going to be where the regulators have to really.
And who's responsible for deciding which apps are critical and which are non-critical and to fail sometimes?
That's a really great question. I don't have a singular answer. Probably, what data is in the app? What's the impact if it doesn't work? What's the backup strategy if it goes down? I'm sure you could define guidelines in the way that any industry can define the guidelines, but I'm sure there's going to be gray areas, commercial bank accounts.
It's very nicely to Bill Curtis and CISQ and the work of CISQ in promoting industry standards across all markets, but in particular regulated and high risk markets, I guess, Bill, is a way of putting it.
Yeah, so I'm the executive director of the Consortium for Information and Software Quality, which is a standards organization. We work through the Object Management Group, which is a large IT standards organization that has a fast track over to ISO. So we've produced roughly 9 standards related to size and quality of software, and we just had one accepted by ISO that deals directly with the quality of software in terms of reliability, security, performance, efficiency, and maintainability. And it's built out of detecting through static analysis severe weaknesses in software related to those 4 areas, and then building a measure that you could use as a risk indicator for how risky that piece of software is in terms of its reliability or its security or what have you. So that's the work we've done. Who uses these standards? Number one, vendor managers use them in statements of work, in contracts. They use them as acceptance criteria to accept what's coming back. You're acquiring software from all kinds of sources now, especially open source. So you need to know what's in the software, verify it, understand what kind of vulnerabilities it has long before you put it into operation inside one of your application stacks. So this just gives you a way, it gives you a standard for saying these are weaknesses we know shouldn't be in this software when it goes into operation. If we detect them, there needs to be a plan for them to be removed.
And how do you see these standards being used, or in the future, or currently, among government bodies, including supervisors and central banks?
Well, there's actually, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
there's some government banks already, or some government agencies already requiring these, or stating that they'll be using these in their, and that's not just in the U.S. That the Italian government's been very active in identifying standards to use for quality management. So when we're finding a lot of the fact that banks are one of the primary markets for static analysis technology vendors, because of the regulations they have to deal with and what have you. We've seen the Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S. Start to talk about using these technologies because they're just terrified of what can happen with high-speed trading if it gets out of control. You saw what happened to Knight Capital when it went bankrupt in 30 minutes. Because a bad software update basically made $440 million of bad trades. So these kinds of issues are huge, and we're starting to see this. And central banks can take the lead. I mean, whatever the central banks do, others are going to observe. And we find the same thing in the U.S. government. If the Department of Defense adopts it, it spreads rapidly, especially through places like telecom, because they have real-time systems as well. So there's almost sort of a spread. You can watch industry. Once you get a standard in and a government agency adopts it, you can start watching the spread almost in an epidemiological, which is kind of a sensitive issue these days, but you can also see the standard spread in that sort of a way. Okay. It's interesting that especially the outsourcers in India were very energetic in leading the development of some of these standards, because they were facing in their contracts requirements for measures of security and reliability and maintainability. But the problem is the customers all had different definitions of what that meant, and they needed international standards. And so that really was the basis for forming CISQ, was to try to create that standardization so we can all talk a similar language and understand a common set of weaknesses that we shouldn't have in software.
And operational resilience is very much the sort of buzz phrase among regulators. The OCC has been talking about it. The Bank of England has been talking about it. Other regulators have been talking about it, and that typically means a whole range of things, under the umbrella of operational risk, which can be all the lights going out, or it can be floods, but it does also include software risk management. And do you see a trend to, you mentioned the Italians and you mentioned the US agencies sharing much more information. Do you see a trend to the internationalization of these standards and central bank regulated entities coming together to talk about them? Yeah,
with ISO adopting it, because that had to go through a review with all the international standards bodies before it was approved by ISO. So with ISO adopting it, that changed the game. I mean, before that, OMG is international, but it's primarily US. But ISO, it goes across the world. So I think with and that just happened on March 31st. So it's relatively new, but I think that's going to have a huge impact on making it available, making it legitimate to central banks across the globe.
And finally, I mean, we saw last week President Biden's executive order on improving measures against cybersecurity. What impact is that going to have, do you think? Because obviously security runs like a thread through everything.
Yeah, well, we've been in the era of 9-digit defects, right? And I'm not talking bits and bytes, I'm talking dollars and euros. And with what happened with solar winds, we've gone into 10 to 11 digits now. I mean, we're starting to talk in the billions, multiple billions of dollars to get some of these problems fixed. And then you just, a week ago, we had the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack that shut gasoline off across the southeastern and east coast of the U.S. So it's getting serious. I mean, these things are running into billions of dollars of impact. now, and it would used to just be a measly 100 million. Now it's becoming serious money. So that financial risk, that financial liability is going to help drive this, and that's something the central banks can put pressure on other banks to show why they can do their due diligence to avoid these kinds of problems, these outages, these security breaches, and what have you.
Yeah, perhaps I can ask you, Mark, at the Bank of England. I mean, whether you talk about DevSecOps in the way that many of the banks and insurance companies do now, and as a way of embedding security testing in the software development lifecycle, or is it a more of a segregated function?
Yeah, it's more of a specialism in firm, separate to what I do. I know that there's a new, funny when Bill was talking about cyber, there's a new program being spun up at the bank primarily about cyber. It's taken very seriously. There's a lot of people working on it. There's a lot of money being thrown at it. But it's kind of like a closed shop to what we do for the more sort of keeping the lights on. It's something that is very much defined in a separate area, unfortunately.
Okay, Knarig, I mean, how do projects like yours interface with security requirements at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York?
Especially for the AI realm, it's extremely, that's one of our biggest hurdles is the security aspect, because our data is very secure, and we need a lot of data when we're processing anything, right? So like if we would truly like to first build and then test our software, we would need not just like 10 documents, but hundreds of thousands of documents. And so that has been, we've had to talk quite a bit with our security team, risk groups, to figure out newer, like different types of protocols and policies around the security. So at this point, I think it's still in conversation, like in the higher ups, they're trying to understand in what way we could employ AI and what controls we need to put in place. But for our purpose, when we were developing this, we used whatever was in place to get things done. So for example, like we were using a language model that does the machine learning component. Initially, when we built this, we used the open source one that was available to us. And we supplemented that with, let's say, the lexicon for whenever we were doing a match within a lexicon term, we would do exact matches of very domain specific terms, which would most likely not be in the open source one because it's not built with our documents. After a year where they tested this, they liked it, they wanted their own language model. So we built a language model with our own documents. However, it was again contained in a very specific environment. We can't just take 100,000 documents and place it wherever we want. Yeah. This, so it has to reside on the production servers. So we did that on the production server. We ran the model, we created the model on the production server during the off hours, and now we're testing it. So, we're doing workarounds, but what we would really like, and I think there is this effort at the bank as we migrate towards AWS and the cloud, is to have this kind of hybrid environment for these types of more innovative projects where we do need production data when we're developing and testing, but we still have to have a development environment. It's not going to be something that, you could put in production immediately. So the security controls have to be as tight as it would be if it was in production, but we need to have leeway to be able to process this, 100,000 documents and do experiments on them. So it's been a learning process on both sides.
Okay, thank you, Knarig. We've got one question. We've got a minute left. So Adam, I'm going to put it to you.
Okay.
And I'm reading it out. Can risk-based testing be coupled with machine learning? If yes, how can the data pool be managed to help run test suites across different domains? So,
yeah, the answer is definitely yes. If you're going to do risk-based testing, you're going to look at the trends in historical data that's in your historical testing patterns to find where the weaknesses are, where the gaps are, if you have 1,000 commits in one module, that module probably has risk of changes that could break things. And so I think applying risk techniques is going to require tons of data analysis so that a human isn't up all night doing tons and tons of data queries and trying to manually assess where risk is in a complex system. And I just want to also mention one last thing. Risk management has become a huge thing, which previously was done by a separate domain and a separate team. The agile teams, the requirements management, the project teams, they all have to embrace risk management. And one of the things we've seen with our Spiroplan platform has been the first time bringing together risk managers, project managers, requirements people, BAs, testers in the platform, which is groundbreaking because they all have their own separate requirements in their own worlds, like Mark has. Everyone has their own worlds. You can't do that anymore because that one risk that's in another team's board is going to suddenly come and bite you.
That's a great to stop. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We could carry on for another 40 minutes easily.
Okay.
I mean, thank you all so very much, and maybe we can come back and talk again another time. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Guys.
Session
Thank you.
on retail banking. Thank you.